Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Washington Gun Law TV. I'm Washington Gun Law President William Kirk. Thanks for joining us. Hey, we're going to have a pretty uncomfortable discussion today. That discussion is going to be about gun violence and America's gun violence problem. Now, I don't think there's any disputing that America has a violence problem. Whether or not we want to call it a gun violence problem, that certainly is subject to debate. But here's the thing, is that we really can't begin to solve this problem unless we can actually have an honest discussion about what really causes this problem or what are some of the causations of this problem. And as a country, we're just not prepared to go there yet. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a study that somebody else did, someone that we greatly respect. We're just going to give you some raw numbers. We're going to try to keep it right down the middle. You can decide what all of this means. But like I said, we can't begin to solve this problem until we can start having an honest discussion. So today, let's spend a few minutes and let's talk about the ugly and inescapable truth about America's gun violence problem. Okay, America, what we are talking about is a story that I found on ammoland.com. And if you're not checking out ammoland.com, you should. It is authored by the Kostas Moros. Now, if you're not following Mr. Moros on Twitter, hey, do yourself a favor and subscribe right now. There it is, right there. That's his Twitter handle. Absolutely one of the sharpest minds in the Second Amendment sphere. You will learn a lot from him. You will be thoroughly entertained. Mr. Moros did a fantastic article on AmmoLand, which was entitled "The Racial Disparity in Gun-Related Homicide, a Problem That Must Be Discussed So It Can Be Solved." And I'm going to just let you know all right now that we're going to have a very uncomfortable discussion. I recognize this is a sensitive topic, and I recognize that not everyone who watches this video is going to see things our way, and that's fine. Are we saying that we absolutely positively know what the problem is? No, we're not saying that, but I think these numbers are going to illustrate a lot to you. I am going to focus on the stats today, and I recognize that some people in the comment section are going to start talking about some of the societal and economic causations of those numbers. That's a whole separate video. That's a whole separate series of videos, one that we're probably not going to get into here at Washington Gun Law. But I do acknowledge that, yes, even deeper analysis would help illustrate more accurately what the problems truly are. You see, one of the problems is that when the White House Office of Gun Violence was created as part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, we were told that gun violence was an epidemic, a nationwide epidemic. But the truth of the matter is depending on what demographic group you live in, that may or may not be true. Now, we're going to be using the CDC's data on homicides and other violent crimes, and understand that gun violence is going to be defined here as a violent crime committed by one person against another person which uses a firearm. The other thing you need to be aware of is everything is going to be based in per 100,000 individuals, so it gives you an understanding of what is the likelihood that something terrible may happen to a person within this demographic group, or how frequently it would occur per 100,000 individuals in that particular demographic group. Okay, the first piece of data I want you to understand on. According to CDC, in 2023, the likelihood that you would be the victim of a homicide based upon your race as the victim was the following. For white Americans, it was 2.8 per every 100,000. For Asian Americans, it was 1.7 for every 100,000. For Hispanics, it was 7.1 for every 100,000. For Native Americans, it was 13.6 for every 100,000. And for African Americans, it was 28.6 for every 100,000. Which means you have neighborhoods in the same city where one segment of the population is living like they're in Eastern Europe where there are no guns, and the other neighborhood, just a few blocks down the street, are essentially living in a neighborhood that represents, Honduras or parts of Mexico. Okay, now that just tells us about the race or ethnicity of the victim. But we also need to focus on the shooter, right? Okay, now, according to FBI crime statistics, the most recent of which that were studied for purposes of this article was in 2018, 81% of all Caucasian victims were actually attacked by a Caucasian perpetrator, okay? And for African Americans, 89% of African American victims was attacked by an African American perpetrator. So, according to the data relied on for this study, there is a high probability that the color of the victim and the color of the attacker are the same. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what the data says based upon ethnicity as to how likely were you to be the victim of an actual firearm-related homicide. For white Americans, it was 1.8 for every 100,000. For Asian Americans, it was 1.0 for every 100,000. For African Americans, it was 24.6 for every 100,000. So what does that all mean? Well, it means that if you want to start trying to solve America's gun violence problem, we're going to have to start talking about what truly is the problem. I mean, this would be like the CDC coming out and saying, hey, we have a massive cancer problem, but then never trying to figure out what was causing the cancer. And here's another inconvenient truth for all the viewers out there. If you're Caucasian, the likelihood that you're going to be shot is pretty darn remote. If you're African American, unfortunately, there's a reality to that. And yet, despite all of that, white Americans outpace African Americans by a long shot for gun ownership, even though the statistics prove that it's the African American community who's most likely going to be endangered and therefore most likely going to need to use lawful and lethal self-defense. Now, one of the common attacks that we see from the Giffords and the Everytowns and things like that is that lax gun laws lead to more homicide. Is that true? Well, we're not going to be able to solve that equation forever, but I do want you to focus on a state that Mr. Moros focused on, which was the state of Louisiana. Because the state of Louisiana typically is near the top of the list when it comes to gun-related homicides. But when you dive further into Louisiana's numbers, this is what you find. In the year 2023, 89 Caucasians were killed by a gun-related homicide, or roughly 3.4 for every 100,000. However, in the same year, 626 African Americans were killed by a gun-related homicide, or 42.4 for every 100,000. That's 12 times higher. And so it begs the question, is it the lax firearm laws that contribute to Louisiana's high numbers, or is it the actual demographic breakdown of their state's population? But listen, you can even microanalyze the data a little bit more. Let's take a look at African Americans, but let's take a look at it upon gender, because this is what the data also shows. Is if you're an African American woman, the likelihood that you're going to be a victim of a gun-related homicide is 6 people for every 100,000. But if you're an African American male, that goes up to 44.7 for every 100,000. Okay. So you see, we're beginning to see a trend here, an alarming trend, but then if we take a look at African American males and we break it down by age, now you're really going to see some scary numbers. Because the numbers for age 5 to 14 are only 5.9 for every 100,000. However, by the time it's 15 to 24, it's now 100 for every 100,000. And age 25 to 34, it's still 86.2 for every 100,000. 35 to 44, it's still 62.2 for every 100,000. And at age 45 to 54, it's only come down to 31.6 for every 100,000. And listen, if you just take a look at one of the youngest age groups there, age 15 to 24, and you break it down just by 3 ethnic groups, this is what else you see. Caucasian Americans age 15 to 24 have a likelihood in 3.4 for every 100,000 individuals that they will be victimized by a gun homicide. Hispanic males age 15 to 24, however, the rate jumps to 18.3 for every 100,000. But for African American males, it's 100 for every 100,000. So the truth of the matter is, America, is if you believe there is a violence problem, if you believe there is a gun violence problem, if you believe that society as a whole just needs a reckoning and we absolutely need to clean up our act, we cannot even begin to solve the problem until we first have an opportunity to have an honest discussion about what causes that problem. And there is no issue in America that we do a worse job of trying to discuss and resolve than it comes to race. And while that problem used to be blamed on many on the right for their unwillingness to have an open mind, it's now really the blame shifts mostly to those on the left who believe that anyone who doesn't see the world exactly according to them is obviously racist, misogynistic, or homophobic. But like I said earlier, if the CDC suddenly had a huge press conference about an alarming rise in stomach cancer, and yet you find out that they were doing nothing to investigate what was causing that stomach cancer, well, then you'd beg the question is, are we ever going to solve this problem? And that is the exact problem that America comes to when we talk about gun violence, or more importantly, the ugly and inescapable truth about gun violence. Listen, we're going to go ahead and link up the article down below so that you guys can geek out on it for yourself. We're going to also link up Mr. Moros on Twitter, so you guys should follow him. You really should. Kudos to you, Mr. Moros. Nice work. If you got any other questions about this or anything else related to what's left of our Second Amendment rights, you guys should know how to get a hold of Washington gun law by now. If you don't, that's okay. That information's down there in the description box. If you got an idea for a video we should be doing around here, cool. Tell us all about it. Click on that link right there and let us know. If you just want to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, the ability to do all of that is right down there in the description box. And then finally, and most importantly, let's remember that part of being the lawful and responsible gun owner, like we talk about all the time here, is to know what the law is in every situation, how it applies to you in any instance that you may find yourself. Until next time, thanks for watching and stay safe.